Hi, Misha here, and I've done quite a few deep dives recently on different subjects, some fiction, some real, and I will do one on the U.S. Air Force as well as the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. But today I want to really kind of focus in on Convair's deltas, specifically the F-102A Delta Dagger and the F-106A Delta Dart, which was originally meant to be the F-102B, but lots of changes. In fact, I've got a couple of different versions here of the two, just one of the six because there's not a lot of differences externally. These are all three from Hobbymaster 172 scale diecast. We will talk about the weapons. These are modular bays you can plug into them. Each is a little different. And it's really an interesting story. You don't really think of Delta Wing aircraft when you think of the U.S. Air Force. And these were the last dedicated true interceptors ever used. And if you count both the 2 and the 6, they served for almost 35 years total. And, well, one of them was flown by George W. Bush, at least in theory. I have a friend that has a hard time believing it, but he wants a picture of Bush flying one. I have to remind him there was a 102 two-seater as well, but I digress. But yeah, I think it's an interesting story, and when we do the overall U.S. Air Force, we won't be able to go into as much detail as I'd like here, so sit down, grab a drink, and let's go back to right after the Second World War, and really the beginning of the Cold War, and the nuclear threat from the Soviet Union. So, 1946, 1947, Russia will become a nuclear power, and it soon realized that Russia ripped off the B-29 to make the Tupolev Tu-4, but they will have new and better bombers coming very soon. And of course, when Russia would officially announce their first nuclear weapon, that would just put everyone more and more on edge. 1947, the U.S. Air Force becomes independent from the U.S. Army, and as early as 1948, a board of senior officers, experienced officers, makes a recommendation for an ultimate interceptor model of 1954 with pretty much a combined weapons system to push it forward. Interceptors were intended for pretty short range, point defense, the intercept bombers, that kind of thing. Different from a fighter, definitely different from a fighter bomber. Their proposal, general as it was approved in February of 1949, and then later that year a decision was made to kind of make a complete system, a weapons system as it was known. This would include, of course, an airframe, a fire control system, FCS, and a new generation of missiles, guided missiles as it would be. And it was actually decided to build the airframe after selecting the FCS so that compatibility could be ensured. It was also decided to really not do a lot of prototyping and to pretty much jump into limited pre-production, not unlike what the Soviets would do with their planes. If you notice, a lot of Soviet planes, the first models are only built in a few dozen, maybe 100, and then they rework them. This has pros and cons. Anyway, by 1950, things are underway, and they first announce what they want for the FCS. They send their needs out to 50 companies. 18 respond with proposals early that year, and by July, they've really started to narrow it down, and it really gets down to 2 companies quite quickly, Hughes and North American. And there was an idea at first, hey, let's award contracts to develop the FCS to both. in a backup plan. Makes sense, very British. In the end, though, by 1951, they select the Hughes, and a contract is initially rewarded. Hughes would also end up responsible for the missile system, the Falcon system, also from Hughes. And going back to July of 1950, the earliest requirements for an airframe are released. And in January of 1951, they have 9 submission proposals from 6 companies. And by that summer, the down select is to 3 companies: Lockheed, Republic, who really wanted it, they had a lot of design proposals, and Convair. And then Lockheed drops out to go for other projects. Keep in mind, this is right when the Korean War is starting to heat up, and you'll have things like the F-104 starfighter result from this, but that's down the road in a different story. So by 1951, it's down to Republic and Convair. Hughes has the contract for the FCS, which will first be designated as the 1079 or 1179. Later it would be the MA1 system. They're working on that. They're hoping this all comes together. Which airframe to select? First on the spinny thing, we have an example from the Greek Hellenic Air Force and their unique camo scheme. I didn't get to pick up one of the Vietnam camo ones, so this seemed like it would do instead. Plus it is different in a few ways from the later one we'll look at. But that's down the road. This is a long story. Republic's proposal, they internally called the AP-57, and the Air Force gave it the designation of XF-103. It was a pretty radical, high speed, they on paper claimed up to Mach 3, capable ramjet, had all kinds of new proposals. It was a very advanced design, again, to work with the Hughes fire control system. Convair, on the other hand, they've been working with Delta Wings since around 1948 with some ex-German assistance. Delta Wings were kind of felt to be the answer to supersonic speed. That was definitely part of the requirement. Keep in mind, in 1951, supersonic was still more of a dream than a reality. And they proposed an internal weapons bay to prevent drag in the slipstream. They would get the designation of XF-102, and the whole project together was known as the WS-201 for, again, weapons system, the whole thing. The Air Force evaluated both designs, but in the end, the Republic design, while it was very intriguing, they did not think it would be ready by 1954. They projected the earliest 1957, 1958. It was just too advanced, so it was ultimately disqualified. Therefore, by the end of 1951, Convair was the default winner. There's only one left standing. So it was meant to be combined with the Hughes system and the Hughes Falcon missile, which its development started way back in 1946, although it was changed many times, with the first test firings in 1949. It evolved over time from a subsonic to a supersonic missile, and 2 guidance versions, IR for thermal, and semi-active radar, SAR, were developed. And it went from being a fighter missile to an anti-bomber missile, which would have implications when Vietnam would roll around. So that's where we're at. And 2 YF-102 prototype or pre-production models were ordered, built, and then from there it was hoped to just stick it into full production. But already problems were arising. Convair planned to use the J67 engine, which was to be a license-produced version of the Bristol Olympus engine from the UK, but it was not ready yet. It wasn't supposed to be. What they ended up asking for was use of the much less powerful J40 engine for the test models, and they projected it would have a top speed of about Mach 1.8 with the J40. With the more improved engine, they projected up to about Mach 2, maybe Mach 1.9. This substitution was allowed, and therefore the first prototype was nearly complete in 53, the second one not far behind. Finally, on October 23rd of that year, the first prototype would take to the skies and didn't do well. And it really didn't do well 9 days later when it was lost in a crash. The second prototype would fly in January of 1954, and it couldn't even go supersonic. It bottomed out at about Mach 0.9 something, 58 in that vicinity. Not supersonic, much less close to Mach 2, even with a less powerful engine. Speaking of engines, that J67 was super behind schedule by 1953, looking like it wouldn't actually happen, and therefore a substitution was made for the J57. More powerful than the J40, but not what originally was designed for. The 57 would also later be used on the F-105 of Thud fame. But even before the first test flights in the middle of 1953, Convair knew they had a bit of a turkey on their hands. Convair was considering a redesign, but they were limited because of the whole scheme to produce the F-102. Tooling was already ramped up, production was already there, because they didn't really have the full prototyping stage followed by pre-production and all that. But they did the changes they could. The biggest one was the use of aerial ruling. It's kind of famous for this aircraft. It has this wasp waist here where it's bulged in the front and tapers in and then flares back out. This was a recent discovery at the time for airflow at supersonic speeds in the slipstream. So they redesigned that. The fuselage was lengthened. The cockpit was made more narrow, kind of pinched in. The wings were changed a bit, given different edge and droop, made a little bit larger as well. The new engine, okay, the 67 is not happening. So they end up going with an uprated version of the J57, which requires a little bit of reworking of the engine bay, the intakes, all that good stuff. And actually, quite early on in production, the tail would change a bit too. The first few would have the old tail. In fact, the first few productions would even be a straight fuselage because, again, they'd already started kind of making them. They would also add a second wing fence on the inside here. Little changes like that, trying to get this up where it needs to be. I do like the air brake in the back here. With these Hobby Masters, you can deploy it either open or closed. Yeah. So the program was not exactly behind schedule in 1954, but it was supposed to be in service by this time, and it's not happening. Luckily, in March, with the changes Convair was proposing, the program was not canceled. In fact, the order was confirmed. They were hoping to have 1,000 for the fleet, and they would start building new prototypes. Now, the originals were known as the YF-102. The redesign was known as the YF-102A. And a total of 4 of these would be built for testing, and the first would fly in December of 1954. And luckily for Convair and the design, it did go supersonic, but probably not as much as they'd hoped for. Instead of being Mach 1.8 or 1.9 or even 2, it really bottomed out at about Mach 1.25 with full armament and everything a little over Mach 1.2. Luckily, the ceiling was increased. It wasn't even able to get to a little over 50,000 feet originally. Now it's up to about 53,400 feet. Still not as much as they'd hoped for, but yeah. But it wasn't just Convair. Hughes had issues with the fire control system, so an interim measure known as the MC3 was adopted, and it would have the early GAR-1 Falcon and GAR-2 Falcon being a semi-active radar and IR thermal. Later, after 62, these would be the AIM-4 and AIM-4B, I believe it was. Or was it A? I don't know. They get confusing. We'll get to it in a minute when we get into the weapons more. This was the first U.S. Air Force jet, fighter, interceptor, not to have a gun, to rely on missiles. And the fire control system, even the interim measure, was meant to be quite advanced. It helped direct the plane to the target, calculate and fire the weapons and salvos. Typically, you would fire at least 2 missiles. Well, I think you had to fire at least 2, but you would have an IR and a thermal for guaranteed hit, which, yeah, on a bomber. But you could ripple fire more than that if you needed to. And as a backup, it had folding fin aerial rockets, FARs, in the doors. So yeah, production contract was issued, and the first production model, F-102A, flew in June of 1955. And from that, it was able to be introduced into service. But changes were far from over. In fact, the whole F-102A was meant to be an interim solution. It didn't have the full fire control system it was wanting, and the Air Force wanted. It wasn't capable of the performance that they wanted. So the idea was, well, let's get the F-102A in service now as an interim measure, and we'll do the F-102B as a full service measure, which that shouldn't take too much time, right? It should be able to come into service quite quickly, and that'll be the standard version. But because of rising Cold War tensions and changing needs and increased Soviet bomber threat, something was needed right now. And so the interim would enter into service. Now let's put the U.S. color one on, more in the Air to Force Air Guard scheme. What to say about it? I will point out that as early as 1952, they wanted a 2-seat trainer version, but this was tabled with all the issues. It was revisited in 1954, and the first prototype of the TF-102A would fly towards the end of 1955. They would ultimately build 1,000 of these, with the main production being in 56 and 57. It's actually here where we see a change worth noting. The original one had a Case 10, Case X wing. In mid-1956, late year, they went to the Case 20 XX wing, and they would actually change the tip front and back a bit. Also required changing of the gear doors. So they recontoured especially the edge of the wing. This gave better takeoff and landing performance. Also gave it a slightly higher max altitude. Some sources claim up to 56,000 feet, depending on, but it just reduced drag and whatnot. So you'll see Case 10 and Case 20 wings. Some places have said that older planes were retrofitted with the Case 20 wing, but this doesn't seem to be the case. The first aircraft we looked at, the Greek painted one, had the Case 10 wing. So, yeah, that's kind of how different production changes. And there would be other changes throughout. For example, these would get radar early warning sensors. They would get an IRST and infrared tracking system in front of the nose there, They would get an artificial horizon, little changes like that. It was continually upgraded in service. Even if production was over by 1958, yeah, the existing aircraft would be continually improved as best they could. Speaking of, let's talk about the weapons in a little bit more detail. Here are the two base sections. This is from the Greek one, the Case 10 wing. This is from the US one, Case 20. From the outset, this was designed for the Falcon missile made by Hughes. Like I said, the GAR 1 and the GAR 2 were the first production models, SAR and IR respectively. These were direct hit warheads, about 7.5 pounds, meant to hit a bomber. They did not have proximity fuses. Roughly a 6-mile range, give or take the variant. The first generation, the GAR 1 would be replaced by the GAR 1D, and the GAR 2 by the GAR 2A. They would just have performance improvements best they could. Those would become the AIM 4A and AIM 4C respectively. The AIM 4A would be the kind of the premier SAR type. Finally, around 1963, the GAR 3 would be introduced as an improved IR, becoming the AIM 4D of Vietnam fame / infamy. And it was the best this generation of IR got. Aside from not having a proximity fuse, they just had a limited warhead, and each one had a bit of a detraction. The SARs had quite a long lock time and needed contact. The thermal, which is more fire and forget, aside from getting confused by things like the sun or the ground or anything else with heat, the warhead had to be cooled before launching. I think it took a few seconds to cool it off, and they only had so much coolant. This was really a problem in the F-4 Phantom, not quite as bad in the F-102, but still, yeah, you had limited coolant. Yeah. In addition, they had rockets, as I mentioned, and they did them quite interestingly. Originally, they used the 2-inch rocket, the 51 millimeter. They had 36 of them. There were 3 tubes in the 4 doors, multiple per tube. These are, of course, unguided. These would very quickly be replaced in 1956 by the 2.75-inch, the 70 millimeter, the Mighty Mouse rocket. And that was kind of the definitive one for this, about as good as far as ever got. You also saw it on the F-86D. But these were considered of limited use, but even though they were a little outdated, they were just direct fire. The idea was for low altitude. These early guided missiles did not do well at low altitude, and their hit rate was kind of eh. And keep in mind, they typically fired them in salvos of 3 missiles, so you only really had 2 shots. And then, what else? So you have your rockets, if all else fails. The rockets can be fired in combos of either 6, 12, or all 24. And it only took a couple of seconds to snap open the bay doors and release all 24 rockets. And what was neat about the fire control system, when the pilot selected rocket instead of missile, it actually did not lower the missile. They're on these mounts. I think they're called trapeze mounts, where they'd pop down, but when they weren't needed, they'd stay up in the bay, and only the rockets would get exposed, because the pilot could select using the FCS. But yeah, that's all they had. No gun, nothing like that to fall back on. So the rockets would hang around. Now, in 1961, thereabouts, the F-102 would go nuclear. They would test it with the Genie rocket used on the 101 Voodoo, but never deploy it with. Instead, it had the GAR-11, which was the AIM-26A. It was a about half kiloton yield warhead. Kind of an interesting missile because it was the only guided missile with a nuclear tip that the U.S. Air Force ever deployed. And it had a proximity fuse because it was meant to go for a bomber group. There was even an AIM-26B introduced a short time later with a conventional warhead that was about 48.5 pounds. So quite a bit larger than the 7.5, give or take, originally. And it too had a proximity. So these are about the best things going, the AIM-26 Falcons. They were only able to put them in the center bay because there was a little more room, and they could carry either one or two. The outside left and right bays still carried the older AIM-4s. And when they put on the 26, they had to remove the rocket tubes, reducing the rocket load from 24 to 12 of the Mighty Mouses. And that's how it would pretty much stay configured. Never a gun, anything like that, till its end. So the weapons were all internal on this bay here. 3 sections, 2 door sets. The only thing external were drop tanks, fuel tanks here. 2 types were used, a 192 gallon and a 215 gallon. But these were only ferry tanks because attached, it slowed the F-102 to subsonic about Mach 0.95. So getting from place to place, that's fine, but not very good for intercepting bombers because needed to build. Of course, it impacted the climb too, but it extended the range. Pretty much standard tanks there. Again, you can see the Erst in the cockpit of this one or in the front of it. A little more antennae in the back. And again, it has the later style wing. Here the air brake is closed. And yeah, that's the F-102. Officially, it was given the name Delta Dagger, but that was really never used. In fact, F-102 was rarely used by the pilots. This was known as the Deuce. The U.S. Air Force began receiving these and issuing them out, training squadrons on them in April of 1956. And in June, the first squads were provisionally ready. And by 57, they were in widespread use. By 1958, these started to be deployed overseas, for example, Iceland, Europe, Greenland. Greenland was important because it was the most northern place the Air Force could place these to intercept Russian bombers expected to come over the northern pole. Thank you, Admiral Byrd. And so, yeah, that's where they were stationed. And they were improved. For example, the Hughes initial -3 fire control group would be replaced by still an interim but improved MC-10 fire control group with more capabilities, less bugs, less glitches. To be fair, it was a very advanced computer system for that day and time, and therefore it was going to have problems, and it was using 50s era's computer technology. Take it as you will. Nevertheless, by the mid-60s, they had really pushed the F-102 as far as they could. They had built roughly 880 production models with 111 TF-102A 2-seat trainers. By the way, the trainer, the crew sat side by side, so it had a fatter nose. Therefore, it was subsonic again, but still useful for training. And yes, the exact production run, including prototypes, pre-production, everything, was right at 1,000. And these are to equip a number of squads and fill the gap. Because the 102 took so long to come into service, the 101 Voodoo would kind of fill its role. And that from Douglas, of course, would lead to the F-4H Phantom, and eventually would partially replace this as well. But as I said, the F-102A was the interim solution, and its fire control group was the interim solution as well. The F-102B was sitting in the background this whole time, and there were highs and lows for it too. If you think the days of major difficulties and delays are behind Hughes and Convair, you'd be wrong. So yeah, the F-102B. The whole design goes all the way back to 1951-52, when the idea was to put the J-57 in the interim and then the J-67 in the full featured model. Same goes for the FCS from Hughes. But because of all the delays in the 102 and issues, this project got pushed further and further back. In 1955, when it was clear the 67 wouldn't happen, the switch to the improved J-75 engine, essentially just an upgraded 57 with some other things, was allowed by the Air Force and made by Convair. And therefore, finally, at the end of 1955, a mock-up of the F-102B was first shown off to the Air Force. And it did feature the MX-1179 Hughes FCS, which was the full featured variant that had all the things they wanted. But a lot of the funding for the B was sucked up. Therefore, in early 56, the Air Force only ordered 17 of the new design, all for testing. And Convair had made some pretty good changes to the airframe. Some was just to streamline production and ease maintenance for the ground crews. Also try to improve maximum speed, altitude, acceleration. Some were to fit the new engine. For example, the fuselage had to be lengthened a bit, which led to a slightly larger wing. The intakes were moved a bit and given variable positioning for performance. The original aircraft was a little over 68 feet long with a wingspan right at 38 feet. This one is over 70 and a half feet long with a wingspan about 38 and a quarter. A new tail was designed and added. The canopy was revised. The cockpit. Many changes like that. Generally, it was just a cleaner, sleeker design because they had more time to do it. The Air Force almost canceled the whole thing, though, because the first couple of prototypes didn't do so hot. The first one flew December 26, 1956, and the second one 2 months later in February. These were able to approach Mach 2, but after about Mach 1.6, 1.7, the acceleration became incredibly sluggish. So it could get there, but it took a long time. Also, just the engine and the updated fire control group, which would soon be known as the MA-1, just weren't that reliable. It had other issues besides. So they'd waited all these years. We're almost into 1958, so 4 years behind the projection for the ultimate Interceptor, which was supposed to be out in 1954. They had accepted an interim measure in the 102. And now, this is not looking so great. I will say, in 1956, it was changed designation from 102B to F-106A. And in 1957, the name Delta Dart was applied, although much like Delta Dagger, this was rarely used by the crews. Just as the 102 was known as the Deuce, this was often just called the Six. And it probably would have been canceled if it hadn't been for the Air Defense Command, the ADC. They really pushed for this to go forward because the F-101 Voodoo was doing a good job. The 102s, well, they were in service. They had them. But they pushed ahead with this. So the Air Force, who originally had only ordered 17 for testing, decided to place an order for 120 in 1957. And the first 36 of these were earmarked for further testing and all that. So there were 2 prototypes and essentially 35 pre-production models. 120 is better than none, but Convair had hoped for a contract of 1,000. Eventually, in 58, the total order would be expanded to 350, which again is better than 120, but still far short of what they hoped for. This would actually result, since they had so few, in the pre-production models, 35 of them, being retrofitted with full features to become standard service F-106As. And speaking of service, finally, in May of 1959, a full 5 years behind schedule, deliveries began to the Air Force, and the first squadron started flying these in October of that year. There would also be the F-106B 2-seat variant for training, of course, and what have you. So you'd think maybe by 59 the troubles are over, but oh no. In December of that year, a canopy came off in flight. That worked well, so the fleet was grounded. Also, the first 12 pilots or so that tried to eject from the 6 were killed because this had the exact opposite of a 0-0 ejection seat. Far from it. In fact, it wouldn't be until 1965, when it had its 3rd ejection seat installed, that they would get a reasonably good 0-0 ejection seat in these. In the beginning, they were kind of focused on supersonic, high-speed, high-altitude ejections, but they soon decided this isn't really where ejections happen, so, low to the ground, lower speeds, that's where we need to focus, and so eventually they would get it. Originally, of course, they just had the same seat as the F-102. The Hughes MA-1, when it worked well. It would link with the semi-automatic ground system, the SAGE system, which could pretty much control the plane from the ground. It could direct the pilot, kind of steer him in, because this is a single-seat plane, so the pilot's having to do a lot of took the workload off. Whereas the 102 had an Erst added, this one had, from the beginning, it's in this dome in front of the cockpit. It actually extends out. It gave it better range than its internal radar, up to about 180 miles. But yeah, early on, the Hughes system just had lots of faults. In fact, there were 60 hardware and software changes made over the next decade or so. And the airplane, the engine had reliability problems. There were fuel flow problems, things of that nature, power issues. There were 2 major design improvement update programs between 1959 and 1961 for the F-106. And so by the end of that year, as we get into 62, most of the big issues were worked out, except for that whole ejection seat thing that killed you. Originally, like the 102, it took 2 underwing drop tanks. They were the 230-gallon variant. But later on, a new variant here, which held 360 gallons, was developed. But what was more important, this was capable of supersonic flight and maneuverability. It held more fuel, and thanks to the redesign, it didn't impact performance, not just in terms of speed, but also acceleration and rolling, turning, all that. So whereas the F-102 rarely had tanks in any kind of combat use, the 106 usually carried them because there was such a small weight penalty for the increased range. The J75 engine would also be improved over time for reliability, all that good stuff. In 67, these would get a retractable aerial refueling probe too, behind the cockpit there. And other little updates like that. So yeah, that's the Interceptor here. Whereas the original really couldn't do much past Mach 1.2. This could get up to Mach 2.3, although in reality it would rarely exceed Mach 2. The original could get up to 53,000 feet originally. With the newer wing, that could be extended up to 55, 56 even. This had a max altitude of about 57,000 feet. And like I said, it is a little larger. And the weapons payload was changed, as you would expect, too. Here are our original bays. Here's the one for the 106. You notice these have 6 Falcons. This only has 4. That might seem less potent, and it may sound on paper even worse because these had the 2 3/4 inch rockets. With the 106, they decided to get rid of the rockets. They were dated. Yeah, no need. In fact, the 102 was the last U.S. Air Force aircraft to fly with the unguided folding fin rockets in general. However, it's deceptive. For one, a new generation of Falcon, known as the Super Falcon, was introduced by Hughes in 1958 and would go into service in the 60s. These were larger rocket motors with a larger warhead, about 28 pounds. They were better, not perfect, but better. There were, of course, SAR, semi-active radar-guided versions. That would be the AIM-4E and the later improved AIM-4F. There would also be an IR, a thermal version, is the AIM-4G. While not perfect, yeah, they were a big improvement with the better hit and all that. But also in the center, where there would be a point, this doesn't have it, that you could have a 1.5 kiloton Genie rocket, nuclear rocket. It also could carry the AIM-26 too. So technically there were 5 positions in the bay, and it is slimmer overall to fit better. And of course it was combined with the improved, at least when it worked, for our control system for better direction, better hits, improved radar. And the IRST on the 106 was actually quite decent. And because of the fuel tanks, we had better range and all that good stuff. So overall, an improvement. The canopy itself was improved. A little more elbow room for the pilot. Better control layout. The original versions still had the kind of framing like the 102, but in the early 70s, that would be done away with for a cleaner cockpit, better visibility during one of the airplane's many upgrade programs. In fact, around the same time, 1972, some 106s and Project 6 Shooter would get a cannon, a 20mm cannon installed here with 650 rounds in the center point. Once installed, it could not carry the AIM-26 or the Genie rocket. So not all got it, but some did. Again, kind of based on lessons from Vietnam with the F-4D, F-4E, that whole thing. And that would have been really the last big program for the 106. The The last one came off the production line at Convair in December of 1960, and that was the end of it. And the last planes would be received, accepted by the Air Force in July of 1961. Originally, they ordered 350. A total of 342 were ultimately built. 2 prototypes, and then we had 63 two-seaters, and then the bulk, 270-something, were the production model. Again, this is why they ended up converting the pre-production 35 planes. They would have enough to equip 14 squadrons, so not nearly all they hoped for. The 102 would take up the slack, as would the 101 and eventually the F-4 and other aircraft. Primarily, this would be stationed in the continental USA, but it would also go up to Alaska quite early on. It would be stationed in Iceland and in parts of northern Europe. And for a brief time, these would be deployed, I think it was around 1961, in South Korea, but that would be a very limited stint over there. And while it would remain in the U.S. Air Force and Air Guard through the 60s and 70s, and while it was a very good performer, in fact it set records for speed and all that for a single engine jet, and it was finally kind of the ultimate evolution of the ultimate interceptor, and it was liked by pilots, especially when the bugs are all worked out. In fact, it could almost fly itself. The pilot was really only there for takeoff, landings, and for emergencies when things broke down. Again, the Sage system could do a lot of control from the ground. Very good endurance because of the 360-gallon tanks plus the aerial refueling capability. And while it could only carry 4 to 5 missiles, they were at least better and harder hitting than previous. All these things said, it never really saw combat. It never did anything. In fact, its brief time in Korea was probably the closest it ever came to real deployment. There was thought of sending it over to Southeast Asia to operate over Vietnam, but it did not happen. And Canada did talk about buying a version known as the F-106C, but this never even went into production. Canada went a different direction. So there were no foreign users either, so that's what it didn't see combat in foreign service. So pretty much it just hung out in the Air Guard and the Air Force throughout the 60s and 70s, some getting upgraded with a gun, some keeping their nuclear rockets or missiles. But it started to be replaced by the F-4 Phantom as those became available. Other squadrons had demand on those, so the Interceptors were kind of far behind Air Defense Command. Later on, by 1980-81, as the F-15 came around, those started to replace a lot of these. And it goes from there. The 106 ultimately stayed in service for a good while. It was a good interceptor. It did fulfill the program, but of course technology and all that moved on. But interestingly, while this did not see service, foreign or domestic, its older brother, the Delta Dagger, most certainly did. So let's put the camo Delta Dagger back on the stand. As early as 1962, some F-102s were stationed in Southeast Asia. These were based in Thailand and were there to defend South Vietnam against possible Soviet-Russian bombers. But in 1964, they would begin to be stationed in South Vietnam itself, and their role would change as the war heated up. They were used as bomber escorts, like the B-52. They also would escort other large aircraft, like electronic warfare types. They would also do fighter patrol and ground attack. And if you're wondering how an air interceptor did ground attack, well, you're not alone. During the day, they could use their rockets. A lot of them still had the 24 rockets in there, so they could just fire rockets at the ground and hit something. At night, the ones with the Erst installed would use the IR guided Falcons to try to hit trucks or even like campfires on the ground, including some flying over the Ho Chi Minh Trail trying to intercept supplies. As you might imagine, this, while technically it worked, using an air-to-air missile intended for a bomber on a ground target at night was a bit of a stretch of its capabilities. Still, the U.S. Air Force had them, and by this point, the 102 was a proven design, so they sent them. And they would stay in theater for quite some time, not being sent home, at least some of them, until 1968. While there, they would get the Southeast Asia camo paint job, similar but not the same as this Greek one. And some would get the modification to take the AIM-26, which would of course reduce their rocket load. Losses, well, they lost 14, most either accidents or ground fire, anti-aircraft. In fact, only one was shot down by a MiG. A MiG-21 used it was a K-13, might have been a K-5 missile, and a rather odd shoot down. At first, the missile actually failed to detonate, but then it did, and the plane detonated, killing the pilot, unfortunately. So there was one air kill of an F-102. As far as I know, they did not have any air kills of their own. And in fact, when the F-4D Phantom tried deploying the AIM-4 with the Air Force in Vietnam, it only got 5 kills. Out of many, many attempts, the Navy's AIM-9 Sidewinder proved much more effective in the anti-fighter role. But again, not trying to dog on the AIM-4 Falcon, it was not intended for that. Even the later E's and G variants or F variants. So yeah, that was its tour in Asia. But right as its time ended there, it would begin in foreign service. In 1969, Greece started receiving the F-102. Of course, these were not new production. The production line had shut down over a decade before that. These would be refurbished U.S. Air Force planes. And they would receive 19 single-seat and 5 twin-seaters for a total of 24, equipping 1 squadron. And on paper, they were in service in Greece from 69 through 77. But in reality, really they only saw use for a couple of years, about 70 through 72, 74. They would quickly be replaced by the French Mirage F-1C, because this is kind of a limited thing. Pretty standard, except they did get this Greek paint scheme. Of course, they had Falcons. Ironically, though, the other recipient abroad was Turkey. Slightly earlier, beginning in 1968, the Turkish Air Force began receiving F-102s. They would get more for 2 squadrons. This allowed one squad to retire. Well, both of them had old F-84s, Korean War era fighter bombers. They both were able to retire them. They would get roughly 50 Delta Daggers, 40 single, 10 two-seaters. Again, I'm rounding. So 2 squads would fly these. And what's ironic is, in 1974, Greece and Turkey fought over Turkey invading Cyprus. The Turkish planes would, of course, have been refurbished from U.S. Air Force stocks too, although they didn't get the cool Greek camo scheme. Unfortunately, they didn't fight each other. That'd be kind of ironic. F-102s from the Air Force fighting each other. The Turkish 102s would fight Greek F-5s, the Tigers. So, yeah. Now, both sides claim combat and that they had victories, but also both sides claim no combat losses on their end. So, we know they fought, but we don't know who shot who down. It's a little ambiguous. Turkey would keep theirs in service until 1979, by which time the two squadrons would replace them, retiring them. One would be replaced by the F-100C, another surplus aircraft, and the other squad would turn theirs in for F-104G starfighters. Yeah. So that was the foreign service, as it were. Hey, more than the 106. And we come to the end of Convair's Delta series and the end of the video. In the USA, the Air Force started handing theirs in, as did the Air Guard, as early as 1973. By 76, the last Delta Daggers were out of service. The 106 would soldier on quite a bit longer. They would start being cycled out of the active Air Force in 1983, going to the Boneyard. And in 1988, they would have their last missions. In the active Air Force, they were in July, and then they officially retired it that August. The Air Guard would hang on to their 106s only a short time longer, retiring theirs at the end of 1988. So what would happen in the U.S., some would just be straight up retired. Some 102s, over 200, would be converted into target tugs, drones, manned or unmanned, for testing. In fact, the 102 was very helpful to the U.S. Army in trying out the new Patriot missile system in the 1970s. And they would continue to expend 102 target drones through about 1985, 1986, by which time they were all used up. Well, beginning around the same time, 86, the 106 started being converted into a target drone. They would convert about 190 some odd of these over, so the bulk really. And they would be expended by the year 1997. Again, manned and unmanned. So I shall point out that NASA flew half a dozen or so, beginning in the 70s. A couple of two-seaters, mostly single-seaters, and the final NASA test flights were in 1998. And so that was the end for the 106. And they would use its final drones around 2003, I believe. So, yep, that was the end of the Convair. What an interesting plane. The last dedicated interceptor, at least so far. And in some ways, old is new again. The internal base system was kind of dropped with later generations of aircraft going to semi-recessed missiles like on the F-4 and F-15. But now internal bays have come back for planes like the F-117, the F-22, and the F-35. But of course the reasons are different. These were done for aerodynamics. The newer planes are done for stealth. This was not a stealth aircraft. But it's an interesting aircraft, and it doesn't look very American. You think of the Delta Wings, you kind of think of, at least I do, the Mirage, or maybe even the MiG-21. It almost looks like a foreign design. And to be fair, Convair itself, this was kind of its last hurrah, too. Yeah, there was the B-58, but, that was a kind of its own thing. It didn't really go much of anywhere. The Falcon missile, really after its reputation in Vietnam, it was out of service. It only soldiered on with these because they were designed for it. And while that meant it integrated well, it also meant retrofitting them to fire something else would have been either impossible or just too expensive. So they were really the last carriers of the AIM-4 as well. And of course, the bomber threat was very different. ICBMs were more of a threat than actual bombers by the 70s and 80s, plus submarines. Fun fact, though, even though it wasn't really designed to, the 106 in practice had good turning, maneuverability, roll. Therefore, it was, at least in theory, a good dogfighter, even with the tanks on, although it was never called upon for this. I don't know, kind of find it fun. 102, not so much. So what do you think? I think you understand why I made this its own video, but I kind of got fun researching these. With that, I will let you go. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.